October 17th, 1975. New York City was hours away from defaulting on its debt. The greatest city in America was going bankrupt. Essential services were collapsing. Police and firefighters were being laid off by the thousands. Garbage piled up on streets. Subway trains broke down daily. Crime was skyrocketing. The city was dying. President Gerald Ford had refused to provide federal assistance. The Daily News captured his position in a legendary headline: "Ford to city, drop dead." New York was on its own. Municipal workers faced the choice of accepting massive pension fund investments in the city's nearly worthless bonds or watching their city collapse completely. At midnight, if no solution was found, New York City would become the first major American city to go bankrupt since the Great Depression. The financial markets were watching. The world was watching. And in city offices, exhausted officials worked desperately to save the city they loved. This is the story of how New York almost died and how it barely survived. New York in the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, New York City was in serious trouble. The problems had been building for decades. White middle-class families had been fleeing to the suburbs since the 1950s. They took their tax dollars with them. Manufacturing jobs were disappearing. Companies were relocating to the South and abroad, where labor was cheaper. The tax base was shrinking, while the need for city services was growing. The city government had masked these problems with creative accounting. They borrowed money to pay current expenses. They pushed costs into future years. They issued bonds and hoped economic growth would solve the problem eventually. It was financial fantasy. But politicians kept getting re-elected by promising services without raising taxes. No one wanted to face the hard truth. By 1974, the fantasy was collapsing. The city owed billions. The annual budget deficit was over $1 billion. Banks were becoming reluctant to lend more money. The city's bonds were being downgraded. Investors were losing confidence. The whole structure was about to collapse. The budget crisis explodes. In 1974, Abraham Beame was mayor. He was a career accountant and city official. He understood the numbers. He knew how bad things were. But he had won election partly by promising to maintain services and avoid painful cuts. Now reality was forcing his hand. The banks that had been lending money to the city suddenly stopped. In early 1975, the major banks announced they would no longer purchase New York City bonds. Without the ability to borrow, the city couldn't pay its bills. Default was imminent. Mayor Beame had no choice. He announced massive layoffs. Police officers, firefighters, sanitation workers, teachers, thousands of city employees lost their jobs. Services were slashed. Subway maintenance was deferred. Street cleaning reduced. Library hours cut. The city was hollowing itself out, trying to survive. The layoffs devastated city workers. Police officers who had dedicated their careers to protecting New York were handed pink slips. Firefighters who ran into burning buildings were told the city couldn't afford them anymore. Teachers who educated the city's children were dismissed. Many of these workers had families, mortgages, lives built around their city jobs. Now they were unemployed in a city with few other opportunities. The city falls apart. As services collapsed, New York descended into chaos. With fewer police officers, crime exploded. Muggings became routine. Burglaries soared. Areas of the Bronx and Brooklyn looked like war zones. Buildings were abandoned. Some landlords burned their own properties for insurance money. Entire neighborhoods were being destroyed. The subways, already struggling, became dangerous and unreliable. With deferred maintenance, trains broke down constantly. Stations were dirty, poorly lit, covered in graffiti. Crime in the subways increased. People were afraid to ride them, especially at night. But many New Yorkers had no choice. They couldn't afford cars. They needed the subway to get to work. Garbage piled up on streets. With reduced sanitation services, trash collection became sporadic. In the summer heat, the smell was overwhelming. Rats thrived. Disease concerns grew. The city looked and smelled like it was dying. Because it was. Times Square became a symbol of the city's decay. It had always been gritty, but by the mid-1970s, it was a nightmare of porn theaters, prostitution, and drug dealing. Tourists stayed away. Businesses closed. New York was becoming a cautionary tale. A great city brought low by mismanagement and neglect. The financial markets. Panic. The fiscal crisis wasn't just a local problem. New York City bonds were held by banks and investors around the world. If the city defaulted, those bonds would become worthless. Banks would suffer massive losses. The ripple effects could destabilize the national economy. The Federal Reserve was deeply concerned, but there was also a moral hazard argument. If the federal government bailed out New York, what message would that send? Would every city that mismanaged its finances expect a bailout? President Ford and his advisors believed in fiscal discipline. They thought New York should face the consequences of its decisions. Treasury Secretary William Simon was particularly hardline. He believed the city's problems were self-inflicted. Union contracts were too generous. Pensions were unsustainable. The city provided too many services it couldn't afford. He wanted New York to default, declare bankruptcy, and restructure its finances under court supervision. Let it be a lesson to other cities. New York's representatives in Congress fought desperately for federal assistance. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan argued that New York's problems reflected broader economic changes that weren't the city's fault. Congressman Hugh Carey warned that letting New York fail would trigger a financial crisis. But the Ford administration remained opposed. October 1975, the deadline approaches. By October 1975, New York City was out of options. The state had created the Municipal Assistance Corporation, Big Mac, to help manage the crisis. But Mac couldn't solve the fundamental problem. The city owed more money than it could pay. Default was days away. October 17th was the critical date. The city had debt payments due at midnight. If those payments weren't made, New York would be in default. The consequences would be catastrophic. City services would stop completely. Municipal workers wouldn't be paid. The legal and financial chaos would be unprecedented. Mayor Beam and Governor Hugh Carey worked around the clock, trying to find a solution. They appealed to the unions. They appealed to the banks. They appealed to Washington. Everyone said the same thing. There was no more money. New York was going to default. Felix Rohatyn, the investment banker leading the MAC effort, came up with a desperate plan. The city's municipal unions had pension funds worth billions. What if those pension funds bought the city's bonds? The workers would essentially be lending their own retirement savings to save the city. It was an enormous risk. If the city defaulted anyway, the workers would lose their pensions. But if the city survived, the bonds might eventually be worth something. The teachers' decision. The United Federation of Teachers had to decide. Their pension fund was worth about $150 million. If they invested it in New York City bonds, they would either save the city or lose their members' retirement savings. The decision fell to Albert Shanker, the union president. Shanker was a tough negotiator and a brilliant strategist. He understood the stakes. If the city went bankrupt, teachers would lose their jobs anyway. The pension fund would be worthless in a collapsed city. But if they invested in the bonds and the city survived, the teachers would have saved New York. They would have their jobs and their pensions. It was a terrible choice. Shanker met with his executive board. The debate was heated. Some argued they should protect the pension fund at all costs. Others said saving the city was the only way to protect anything. Shanker listened to all sides. Then he made his decision. The teachers' union would invest their pension fund in city bonds. It was an act of faith, or desperation, or both. The teachers were betting everything on New York's survival. Other municipal unions followed. Police and firefighters, whose jobs had been cut, who had every reason to be angry at the city, also invested their pensions. They were saving the city that had fired them. It was one of the most remarkable acts of collective sacrifice in American labor history. Midnight, October 17. At 11:59 p.m. on October 17, 1975, New York City officials made the debt payment. The money came from the municipal workers' pension funds. The city didn't default. New York had been saved, temporarily. But the crisis wasn't over. The city still owed billions. The pension fund investment only bought time. New York needed long-term help. And President Ford was still refusing to provide it. 2 weeks later, Ford's position shifted. His advisors convinced him that a New York default would harm the national economy. The political calculation also changed. Ford was preparing to run for election in 1976. New York had electoral votes he might need. Letting the city collapse would be politically costly. On October 29th, Ford announced that the federal government would provide seasonal loans to New York City. Not a bailout, loans that would have to be repaid. But it was enough. Combined with the pension fund investments and brutal budget cuts, New York could survive. The Daily News, which had printed "Ford to City dropped dead 2 weeks earlier," now ran a different headline: "Ford to City, I'll help." It was too late to repair Ford's reputation in New York. He would lose the state badly in the 1976 election, but the city would survive. The long recovery. The fiscal crisis lasted until 1981, when the city finally balanced its budget and regained access to normal credit markets. Those 6 years were brutal. City services remained limited. Thousands of workers never got their jobs back. Neighborhoods that had been abandoned stayed abandoned. The psychological damage lasted much longer. New York in the late 1970s was a traumatized city. Crime remained high. The infrastructure continued to decay. The population declined as people who could afford to leave did. The city that had been the capital of the world seemed to be in terminal decline, but something else was happening too. Artists and musicians flocked to New York because it was cheap. The East Village, Soho, and the Lower East Side became centers of creativity. Punk rock was born at CBGB. Hip-hop emerged from the Bronx. The city's decay became a source of its reinvention. And slowly, painfully, New York came back. The 1980s brought economic recovery. Crime eventually declined. The subways were cleaned up. Times Square was transformed from a crime-ridden hellhole into a tourist destination. By the 1990s, New York was booming again. But the scars from the fiscal crisis remained. The city was more conservative with its finances. Services had been permanently reduced. The social safety net was weaker. The city that emerged from the crisis was harder, less generous, more focused on economic development than social welfare. For better or worse, the fiscal crisis had changed New York forever. The workers who saved the city, The municipal workers who invested their pensions never forgot what they did. Many of them were teachers like Carol Bellamy, who was president of the city council during the crisis. Years later, she reflected on the decision to invest the pension funds. "We saved the city," she said, "but we also lost something. The trust between the city and its workers was broken. We had shown that we would sacrifice for New York, but the city never showed the same loyalty to us. The layoffs, the cuts, they never really stopped. We saved New York, and New York never fully thanked us." That resentment was real. The workers who had been fired during the crisis were never fully rehired. Many never returned to city employment. Their careers were disrupted. Their lives were changed. They had done nothing wrong. The city's fiscal crisis wasn't their fault, but they paid the price. The pension funds that invested in city bonds did eventually recover. The bonds paid off. The workers' retirements were secured, but the years of uncertainty, the fear that they might lose everything, left deep scars. They had gambled their futures on the city. They won. But the cost was higher than just money. The lesson. The New York fiscal crisis taught brutal lessons. Cities can fail. Services can collapse. The social contract between government and citizens can break. When that happens, the most vulnerable suffer first and worst. The poor, the elderly, the working class, they depend on city services. When those services disappear, their lives become immeasurably harder. The crisis also showed what happens when cities are left to face problems alone. New York's fiscal troubles reflected larger economic changes, deindustrialization, white flight, changing demographics. These weren't just local issues, but the federal government's initial response was to let New York suffer the consequences. Only when the national economic implications became clear did help arrive. And the crisis revealed the power of collective action. The municipal workers who invested their pensions saved New York. Not the banks, not the federal government, the workers. People who had been fired, who had every reason to walk away, chose instead to save their city. It was an extraordinary act of faith and solidarity. Closing. October 17th, 1975. Midnight approached. New York City was hours from bankruptcy. The greatest city in America was about to fail. Federal help had been refused. The banks had walked away. Only one option remained. The workers, teachers, police, firefighters would bet their futures on their city's survival. At 11:59 p.m., the payment was made. New York didn't default. The city survived. Barely. It would take years to recover. The scars would last generations. But New York endured. This is the story of the fiscal crisis, of how mismanagement and economic change brought a great city to its knees, of how political leaders failed to act until catastrophe was imminent, of how workers saved the city that had fired them, of how New York came back from the brink and eventually thrived again. The crisis changed New York forever. The generous city that provided extensive services became more cautious, more focused on fiscal discipline. The social welfare programs that had helped the poor were reduced. The city became harder, more business-oriented, less forgiving of failure, but it survived. Against all odds, despite everyone who said it was finished, New York survived. Because workers believed in their city even when their city didn't believe in them. Because people refused to let New York die. Because sometimes faith and desperation are enough. The city that almost died became the city that couldn't be killed. That's the real lesson of 1975. New York can be brought low, it can face catastrophe, it can teeter on the edge of oblivion. But it will survive. It always survives. Because New York isn't just buildings and budgets. It's the people who refuse to give up on it, even when giving up would be the rational choice. That's what the workers proved on October 17, 1975. They saved New York, not because they were sure it would work, but because they couldn't imagine a world without their city. That faith, that stubborn refusal to quit, is what makes New York eternal. The city almost died, but the people wouldn't let it.